So, chapter one, the sociology of sports. First, it's really important to understand when you're talking about any sociology class that all the chapter content is based on and guided by sociological research and theory. And that research and theory has taken into account the social and cultural contexts in which sports are created, how they're played, how they're given meaning, and especially how they're integrated into people's lives. So, why do we study the sociology of sports, and even, what is it even? A lot of people ask me about teaching the sociology of sports, and they've never heard of that. They've heard sociology of gender, or marriage and family, a variety of other things, but not of sports. So, here's a quote from the opening page of the chapter that kind of, I think, emphasizes how important an aspect of people's lives, their experiences, sports can be. And here's the quote. Why should we play sport? Why not just have everyone exercise? Because sport takes you to the edge of the cliff. And it's at that edge of the cliff where you understand your creative soul. That's a beautiful thought. And that's from Brian Haidline, who's the chief medical officer of the NCAA. So, this chapter, this first chapter addresses primarily four questions. What is sociology? How is it used to study sports in society? What are sports? And how can we identify them in ways that increase our understanding of their place in society? You might be surprised, and you'll see as we work through this, the many definitions of sports, the way how they're held in different cultures, the beliefs around them, etc. And third, what is the sociology of sport? And four, who studies it and for what purposes? So, using sociology to study sport. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, sociology. What is it? I don't know if any of you have taken a previous sociology course. I presume that some of you have. Sociology is the study of the social worlds that people create, and they maintain those. Once they create those worlds, they maintain them. Now, they change through time, of course, and through their relationships with each other, with the creation and the maintenance and a variety of events that happen in the world, and just how times change, right? Culture's very different today than it was 500 years ago, for example. So social worlds are identifiable spheres of everyday actions and relationships. They're created by people, and they involve more than just the individuals that create them, however, acting alone. Uh, they're created by people in kind of a unit, in a sense. It's the interactions of people. So it isn't someone alone who creates social worlds. If you think of the term social worlds, there has to be socialness going on. Okay. So our actions, our relationships, our collective activities, our patterns are all part of the social world. And these patterns create identifiable ways of life and social arrangements that are maintained but also change over time, as we just talked about, through our interactions with each other. That's a main thing that changes them, but events contribute to the change in social worlds too, as you might imagine. They can be very large and impersonal, these social worlds, like an entire nation, or they can be small, uh, personal social worlds that, such as your own family or the people that you're intimate with. But regardless of their size, uh, they cover all aspects of our social life. And that includes, and very especially, the values and beliefs that we use to make sense of our everyday lives and our everyday relationships. It includes the groups, the organizations, the communities and societies we form by making the choices to be involved in those organizations and communities. Uh, the developing relationships that we have and how we participate in broader social life. So, what are some of the sociological concepts of society? Here's the definition of society from this text. Every sociology text has a slightly different definition, but they're all generally the same. The wording might be slightly different. So this text says society is a relatively self-sufficient collection of people who maintain a way of life in a particular territory, which also gets us to culture, doesn't it, as well as society. Now, the in a particular territory issue is an interesting one because that's generally true, but not always true. The example that the text uses is cases where the society and the nation are not the same, such as the Amish and the Mennonite societies in Ohio and Pennsylvania in the United States and other places in the United States. Uh, they don't follow the common United States norms of behavior, of dress, of raising children, of a variety of things. They stand apart. So that's a situation where the nation and the society are not one and the same. What's the goal of sociology? The goal of sociology, and that's why it's such a fascinating study, is to describe and explain those social worlds we just talked about. And that includes societies from the macro of large societies, nation states, to the micro of family and that type of thing. So, including societies, how they're created, recreated, and changed. Because as we talked about a minute ago, there's also always flux and change occurring. It studies how those societies, from large to small, macro to micro, how they're organized, how they influence our lives, and our relationships with each other. In that process, of sociology and studying sociology, we learn to see our own and others' lives in context. This is so crucial because having context to how you behave, how someone else behaves, what you believe, what someone else believes, how various groups are behaving in a culture, it's context that is the crucial aspect to understanding. So, one of the things of applying sociological observation and theory um, is that we learn to see our own and others' lives in context, i.e., in the social worlds in which we live. And in doing that, we can then identify the social conditions that set limits or create possibilities in ours and other people's lives. We will certainly explore this in depth in the chapters, both setting limits and creating possibilities. In the chapters, as I mentioned earlier, on gender, on race and ethnicity, on social class, what limits are set within those categories? What opportunities are there, for instance, in the chapter on social class for people who are extremely wealthy as opposed to people who are not, or highly educated and people who are not? Those are the kinds of questions sociologists ask and study. So, some key sociological concepts. The first one is culture. Okay? Culture, the definition of culture is the shared ways of life and shared understandings that people develop as they live together. So, we talked about, once again, the micro and the macro, the shared way of life in the United States. The, let's take social media, for example. Virtually, the vast majority of the culture uses social media. Guess what? I don't. I've never been on social media in my life. So there you go. Um, Even within the norms, the shared way of life, yet I share a lot of other things, a way of life of everyone else in the United States, okay, or in the modern world. There are exceptions to that, anomalies. So let's do that definition again for culture. the shared ways of life and shared understandings that people develop as they live together. So once that a culture exists, it has a very powerful influence on the social interaction that people within that culture have with each other. What is social interaction? It's people taking each other into account and in the process and communicating with each other, and in the process they influence each other's thoughts, feelings, and actions. So social interaction, that communication with others where we share and influence thoughts, feelings, and actions. And because of that process of that interaction with others, we can anticipate the thoughts and actions of others and predict how they may respond. And here's a sociological concept that's not being mentioned. You can do that as long as people are behaving, quote, normally for what's normal in their society. Then we can anticipate, right? Somebody's going to say, oh, excuse me, or, if you bump into somebody, or that, when you're walking towards someone, one of you is going to move out of the way so the other can get by, that type of thing. That's anticipating. But when people don't follow the norms or the rules, then it gets kind of prickly and iffy sometimes. So through social interaction, we can anticipate thoughts and actions of others and predict how they may respond. So we've done culture, social interaction, and the third one is social structure. Social structure is a macro, a much bigger way of, understanding how society works and that type of thing. It's the established patterns and relationships and social arrangements. And social arrangements is a big part of this that take shape as people live, work, and play with each other. So what we have here, if you think of social structure, it's a structural idea that it's the basis for organization in our social worlds. And so, and it's really a macro perspective. Often social structure has a lot to do with the political system or the educational system, that type of thing. So those three, culture, social interaction, and social structure, create our social world. So let's take, for example, that they're using in your text, a high school soccer team. The social world consists of players, coaches, parents, and supporters. And if you're an athlete, are well aware, over time, every team creates and maintains their own culture, which is a way of life with values, beliefs, norms, and social routines. Everyone involved engages in some form of social interaction. And on top of that, these recurring actions and relationships make up the social structure of the team. So the combination of culture, social interaction, and social structure comprises the team's social world. And that's connected to the larger social world. Peer groups, cliques, and athletic teams are social worlds where participants are known to each other. But if you take this to a larger macro perspective of a social world, so communities, societies, crowds, online chat rooms, etc., are social worlds, but they're social worlds in which people do not know each other well. And because of this, because they don't know each other well, as they do in smaller groups, like athletic teams, what happens is the boundaries of the social worlds, where you don't know the people well, can be clear, but they can also be kind of fuzzy, right? They can be kind of not so clear. So we are always moving between social worlds that are very familiar to us, like team practice or a gender mixed dorm without thinking. We make almost automatic shifts in how we talk and act to accommodate to the changing cultural and structural aspects of the social world. We do it without thinking. It's become automatic. It's so ingrained and embedded in us. Why? Because we've been socialized by the norms of our social world. However, and some of you may have had this experience, uh, moving, going to different cultures, whatever the situation is, getting a different job. However, when we enter a new or unfamiliar social world, we usually pay very close attention to what's happening, and we look for clues. And we look for those clues by watching what people are doing, how they interact with each other, in order to develop a sense of what's going on here. What's the appropriate behavior? What's the appropriately socialized behavior in this particular venue or situation? So here's a really important aspect of this. And one of the things you're gonna learn in this class, one of the main aspects of a sociology class, is what is valid research and what isn't, and how valid research is done. Just because something's printed or somebody says it doesn't mean it's true, okay? So here's the key. Sociological and all social science research, in this case, we're talking about sociology. Sociological knowledge is based on research and theory. Okay? Online research is not necessarily valid research. Okay? In my Sociology 206 social problems class, I have students do news stories 4 times during a term, and the instructions say it must be from a valid news source. Okay? And I give some definitions of that and some examples of that, but I'm always kind of surprised at some of the sources that show up. A, they're not news sources, and B, they're not valid sources. So it's important to understand this information. So online research isn't necessarily valid research. It depends on who did the research, right? Sociological research is systemic, okay? So you might use a lot of different sources. So the author of sociological research might use newspaper articles and other media as sources for examples or to raise issues, but not for research results. Okay? You can read that stuff, you can assess it, but you need to do something much deeper and more intense for research results. Okay? So the statements made in the text about sports and sport experiences are all based on valid social science research, such as studies that use surveys, questionnaires, interviews, observations, and content analysis. And we'll talk in the next chapter about what all that is and means, and other accepted methods of research. Therefore, and this is a key point, the material in this text, or once again, any social science text, psychology, anthropology, sociology, etc., the material in this text is different from blogs, commentaries, and everyday conversations about sports. It's organized to help you think critically and critically examine sports as they exist in people's lives. There's nearly 1,700 sources that are cited in this text. You can look in the back of the text and see those sources that are cited. So understanding the valid research method will help you improve your critical thinking skills. And it will help you to make informed decisions about sports in your life and the social worlds in which you live. So how do we define sports? That's important if we're going to study it this term. To study anything, it helps to precisely define the topic. So, for example, is a sport when a kid chooses teams and plays baseball in the street? Or when people of various ages learn and perform tricks in a skateboard park? Is that sports? These activities, as you could probably recognize immediately, are sociologically different from what happens in Major League Baseball games and a game skateboard competition. The differences become significant when parents ask if playing sports builds character, or community leaders decide if they should fund sports, or schools ask if they're valid educational activities. Does studying, quote, sports include jogging, double dutch, weightlifting, hunting, scuba diving, etc., etc.? Okay. That's not easy to respond to as a sociologist because there is no single definition of what sport is. But according to definitions used in North America and Europe, here's the closest one can come to a definition. Sports are physical activities that involve challenges or competitive contests. They are usually played according to rules. They're organized so that participants can assess the performances and compare them to others or to their own past performances. However, the organization's meaning and purpose of sports varies according to different cultural contexts, okay? Some sports emphasize free-flowing playful action and exist mostly for the pleasure of the participants. Examples are 5K fun runs and skateboarding in local streets and parks. But in contrast, are the sports that are organized by and scheduled and regulated, have regulated actions and spectators. So then an example of that is professional sports that people follow through the media and pay to see in person, like NFL games and professional soccer, that type of thing. However, most sports fall somewhere in between the two extremes. They're formally organized. Even though people watch them, they're mostly for participants who enjoy them, value the required skills, and receive rewards like peer approval and social standing. And examples of those are softball leagues, scheduled volleyball tournaments, and most organized youth sports. This is Luca, by the way, my 2-year-old dog. Those who study sports as social phenomena use a more flexible, inclusive definition of sports than just, quote, organized sports. Current research focuses on here's a definition, okay, of sports by current researchers. Physical culture, which includes all forms of movement or physical activities that people in particular social worlds create, sustain, and regularly include in their collective life. However, one has to acknowledge that organized sports are the central and dominant part of physical culture. So the official definition of sports, being classified as an official sport, gives special status, of course, which increases participation, funding, community support, and visibility, that type of thing. So an example of that in a different culture is in Switzerland and Scandinavian countries, walking, okay? We're talking about official sports, okay? So in Switzerland and Scandinavia, walking, bicycling, Scandinavia. Walking, bicycling, and some forms of general exercise are considered to be sport. Therefore, those who participate see themselves as sports persons and are treated, the key point here is they're treated that way by their peers. So this is a social world where if you walk regularly, for example, you think of yourself as a sports person in our culture, maybe an athlete, and other people view you that way in your society. It's kind of interesting. But in the US, the definitions are much more exclusive and give priority to formally organized competitive activities. So, for example, even though walking is acknowledged to be healthful and it's encouraged, it's in America, it's not described as a, quote, sport. And certainly not an official one as in the Netherlands and Scandinavia. Now that's important from a sociological perspective because there'll be less funding for trails, right? If it's not designated an official sport. Any events involving walking will receive little financial or political support because it's not a, quote, real sport. In wealthy societies, sports include, so in advanced Western societies generally, uh, includes rules, the way you define a sport. It includes rules, competition, scoring, winners, losers, schedule, seasons, records, referees, coaches, governing boards, etc. So the reason that that's important, because those official definitions have important implications that accrue to them or follow from them, more accurately. Definitions that emphasize rules, competition, and high performance mean that many people will be excluded from participating and or decide they're not fit to play or avoid other physical activities defined as, quote, second class because they're not official sports, right? So, for example, a 12-year-old cut from an exclusive soccer team may not want to play in a local league because he sees it as, quote, recreational activity and not as sports. I hope you get that distinction. It's a subtle one, but it's an important one. And what happens is that often leads to people being physically inactive, while at the same time, only a small number of people perform at relatively high levels in front of spectators. So you have this small group of people that are, powerful athletes and making a lot of money in some cases, performing for a huge number of spectators who are completely out of shape. Okay, that's kind of the point there. So what happens? This negatively, in fact, impacts the health of people who are just spectators or think of themselves as just spectators. It increases healthcare costs. We've got an obesity epidemic. But when sport is defined to include a range of physical activities, let's go back to the walking in the Scandinavian countries again. So when a range of physical activities that are played for pleasure and are part of local social life, then overall physical and mental health often improves. How do we know that? We know it through sociological research into that very effect. Okay. So sports, as you might have concluded now, if you know this terminology, are social constructions. And this comes from the concept in sociology called the social construction of reality. What the definition of the social construction of reality is the use of background assumptions to define what is, quote, real. So let me give you the two examples I give in sociology classes. Daylight savings time. Standard time. What's real? The day that the time changes to one or the other, the sun is in exactly the same place the day it changes or the day after. The real world, the universe, has not changed one iota, right? But our construction of reality has changed, and you better go along with it, otherwise you're going to be late to class or work if you don't change the time. Of course, now your devices change it for you, but you used to have to change them yourself. So you get that point? The other one is money. Not that we use currency so much anymore, but it wasn't too long ago we were all using currency. The cards are even one step removed from the currency, which wasn't based on reality because we went off the gold standard in, I think it was 1939, I can't remember exactly what year, but right around there we went off the gold standard. Prior to that, every dollar that was in circulation in the United States and every coin was backed up by gold at Fort Knox. Okay? But when we went off the gold standard, we just started printing money that's based on virtually nothing except that everybody agrees it has value. So those are two examples of the social construction of reality. And there's certainly, as you'll see, excuse me, when we get to those chapters, applied to things like race and gender and a variety of other things. So sports are constructions, as we just said, the social construction of reality, what's real. So one of the more definitions, going into that a little bit more of the social construction of reality, is that parts of the world are created by people as they interact with one another under particular social, political, and economic conditions. So the dollar bill, the time change, all of those things are, social constructions of reality. They're not reality. So, as defining official sports, when you define what is an official sport, okay, and construct the reality around what's an official sport, it's part of a political process. Now, that may strike you as off the wall, but let's see what happens. Because when you define a sport as official, it's going to have benefits that accrue to the people who are involved in that particular official sport. And so those benefit and how you define sport, which sport is official, benefits some more than others. And that has trickle-down effects, certainly in terms of sustaining them in their own social worlds. There are struggles over whose ideas will be used when making decisions about these types of issues. I'm going to tell you right now. What's the meaning and primary purpose of sports? And how will they be organized? Who will play? With whom? And under what conditions? What agencies or organizations will sponsor and control the sports? Those all devolve upon which sports are defined as sports. Okay. So debates over this cause conflicts, as you certainly might imagine. Lawsuits, government intervention, and the passage of laws. So the example that the text gives you is the purpose and meaning of organized cheerleading. Okay? The cheerleading organization, National Cheerleading Organization, has for a while been trying to make cheerleading an official sport. So the argument is over the purpose and meaning of organized cheerleading. And it's, quote, not a sport, opposing people say to those who want to make it a sport. Not a sport. The primary purpose is to just support the teams, okay? But, okay, that's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, competitive cheer teams train and compete. And over 34 high schools designated as an official sport. So this is important. This argument seems maybe like a small, silly thing. However, the larger foundational aspects of it are very, very important because the stakes are high when something is designated an official sport or is not. Things like funding and that type of thing, especially, okay? So disagreements about definitions, as you might imagine, occur most often over funding priorities. So, as you can see, having just talked about all of that, sports are what are called contested activities. They're activities for which there are no timeless and universal agreements about what they mean, why they exist, or how they should be organized. There's a box on page 10 titled Who Plays and Who Doesn't that's very interesting that you should read. Now, if you've read this box, you'll understand why some of these issues we're going to talk about next are important. And this next concept may be challenging, and that's the great sport myth and the resistance to the sociology of sport. And I put up a video of Jay Coakley and the great sportsmen talking about it. He's the one who coined that terminology, the great sportsmith, and has done the most research on it. So Coakley says that what the myth is, the great sportsmith is, the myth that sports is essentially pure and good, and that its purity and goodness is automatically transferred to all who participate in it. Let's repeat this definition of the sports myth. The myth that sport is essentially pure and good, and that its purity and goodness is automatically transferred to all who participate in it. What are some of the related beliefs to that great sport myth? That sport builds character, and that anyone who plays sport is a better person for doing so. Well, the following chapters in this text are going to clearly show you that the, quote, essential purity and goodness of sport is a myth, and that's why he calls it the great sport myth, and that just participating or consuming sports does not guarantee any particular outcomes related to character development or to increased goodness. We hear every day, don't we, about situations and cases that contradict this myth. However, this does weaken belief in it. Those who accept the myth doesn't weaken. The fact that we hear cases every day about bad behavior among athletes or bad behavior among coaches or organizations, et cetera, that doesn't really affect a lot of people's belief in the sports myth. It doesn't. What they do is the people who accept the sports myth that it's all pure and goodness and everybody's going to benefit from it and builds character, they dismiss those bad actors as exceptions. Okay, the acts are committed by, quote, morally flawed individuals. They don't see it as part of the structure of sports. And so what that implies, if it's just flawed individuals having bad behavior rather than some part of the system, then it implies there's no need to study sports to improve them because they're already inherently positive. The sports myth. Okay. So the problem is the morally flawed individuals who should be purged from sports. Sports, according to myth believers, are already, as they should be, a source of inspiration and excitement. Now, throughout the text, it's going to become apparent how the great sports myth and those who believe in it influences some pretty important decisions in that field. Because there's the creation and funding of organized sports programs for at-risk youth to on one hand, to making multi-billion-dollar bids to host Olympic Games. I mean, that's the breadth of the discussion about our sports inherently valuable and good. The myth supports a strong belief in the power of sports to bring purity and goodness to individuals. So, I want you to think about that with your own experiences and see if that's completely true or not. Of course it does that in some cases. We're talking about a macro aspect of organized sports here. So how do we use the sociology of sport? Well, it can be useful to parents, for example, to sports management people, recreation, physical education, public health organizations. An example, you can use the research that sports sociologists have done it can inform parents and coaches about the conditions most likely to produce positive development among children and teenagers involved with sports. It can help explain why some sports have higher rates of violence than others and how to effectively control it. There's been a lot of research done on that. Um, and if you're unfortunately, if you're not concerned with fairness and social justice, it can also, this research can also be used for very selfish purposes. For example, based on research, it can inform football coaches that they can control young men. They can control young men by threatening their masculinity. There's been a lot of research done on this. It's a very effective way of controlling young male athletes. Like coaches, by threatening their masculinity and making them dependent on the coaching staff for approval of their worth as men. We know that from research. If you know that, and my sociologists do it, is to change that behavior of the coaches. But if you know that that research has been done and that that's a powerful effect, you can actually use that kind of behavior. It also shows that that kind of strategy could be used to increase the willingness of young men to sacrifice their bodies for the quote, for the good of the team. You know, you man, buck up, get out there, even though your leg hurts or whatever. We know that that's done from research. We know that it's effective, these particular things on young men. So the point that the way the researchers were looking at it is, how do we change that behavior of the team, the team managers, the organization, the coaches. But when coaches read the research and see how effective that behavior is, then they may utilize it more instead of stopping doing it. So the above, what I just talked about, shows that the sociology of sport, like other scientific disciplines, can be used for many purposes, both good and bad. And therefore, the sociologists who study sports need to consider why certain research questions are asked and how research findings might affect people's lives. Obviously, using knowledge in the sociology of sport is not a simple process with those examples I just gave you. So it has to have another aspect to it, which is invoking critical thinking about the potential consequences. After this class, you should be able to think critically about sports and identify and understand their issues and controversies. You should be able to see beyond just performance statistics, to understand sports as social activities that have both positive and negative effects. And you should be able to understand sports as social constructions and attempt to change them when they unfairly disadvantage some categories of people, which you will learn more about as we progress through the term. What are the controversies created by the sociology of sport? Research can be controversial. We just had some examples of that. When it becomes clear, especially it's controversial, when it becomes clear that changes are needed. And people don't like change, do they? Especially if they're benefiting from the status quo, from the way things currently are. And it often threatens those who control the organizations, because people in positions of power know that social and cultural changes jeopardize their control over others and the privileges that they have. They prefer approaches that blame problems on the weakness and failures of individuals, and solutions that emphasize controlling them more effectively. You see this in political discussions today. You see it on so many levels. You know, you blame the individual rather than look deeply at the system and who benefits from the system as it is. Here's an example, is that they're giving you to show that exact thing, focusing on the bad individual rather than the systemic problems. Research on sport participation of women around the world shows that women, especially in poor and working class families, have lower rates of participation than other categories of people. Gee, I wonder why. Well, there's four main reasons. They're less likely to have the time, freedom, money, and quote, cultural permission to play sports. They have little or no control of the facilities where sports are played or the programs. They have less access to transportation and less freedom to move around at will, depending on the culture. They are often expected to take full-time responsibility for the needs of family members, a job that allows them no time. Okay, how do we know that? That these are reasons why women cross-culturally participate in sports less than men? Through social science research, through sociological research. So we know that. Those are facts, those 4 points. The conclusion: many women worldwide don't see sports as appropriate activities. It's easy to see the potential controversy in these findings because they suggest that, one, opportunities and resources to play sports should be increased for women, that women and men should share control of sports, that new sports organizations around the values, interests, and resources of women should be developed, and that there should be changes in ideas about masculinity, femininity, gender relations, family structures, etc. Can you see how threatening all that might be to the powers that be? So, people who benefit from things as they currently are, from the status quo, will most likely oppose and reject these changes and point out or they'll say that the sociology of sport is too critical, it's too idealistic, that the quote natural order would be basically changed if any of those things were implemented that would encourage the participation of women in sports. So why do we study sports in society? Well, they're very socially significant activities, as we said in the beginning. They can't be ignored, even if you're not interested. We all know when the Super Bowl is on, even though we may not ever watch the Super Bowl, that type of thing. And the Olympics. And that's one reason you can't ignore them. And number two, people talk about them at work, socially, in a variety of places, and that increases one's social capital to be able to talk about, know what's going on and who's playing and that type of thing. And so social capital is very important. Schmoozing for, with your workplace people and that type of thing. So sports reaffirm important ideas and beliefs. The key research topic that is investigated in the sociology of sport is the relationship between sports and cultural ideologies. Remember, we're not born with ideologies. We're like little ducklings. We have to be imprinted with us, and to use the human term, socialized with ideologies. Okay, we learn them as little kids and grow and continuously throughout our life. We learn them as we interact with others, as people consistently give meanings to and make sense of social phenomena, as our parents say to us, don't do that, that's rude. Okay, that type of thing. Share your toys, these are ideologies that we are learning. An ideology is a shared interpretive framework that people use to make sense of and evaluate themselves, others, and events in their social worlds. Even if we don't agree with a particular ideology, it represents principles, perspectives, and viewpoints that are shared by our culture. So we may disagree, but you know what? If you disagree too much and you act out in that disagreement too much, you become what is sociologically called a deviant. A deviant just does not mean the common definition of a deviant in sociology. It just means someone who doesn't follow the norms, the ideologies of a society. So another important point here is that most ideologies serve the interests of particular categories of people, and they're presented as accurate and truthful, and and if you don't question them, right, uh, then they're used to justify decisions and actions. If you think about slavery and the oppression of women, for example, you know, uh, a lot of ideologies were used, which we'll look at in subsequent chapters, to let us know that that's okay. Slavery was okay. The oppression of women was okay. Those are ideologies. It's the people who benefit from slavery or the oppression of women who promote those ideologies. Sports in Society especially explores four ideologies that directly influence how sports are organized, who participates in them, and they're organized around ideas and beliefs about gender, race, social class, and ability, each of which have a chapter of their own in the text. So, gender ideology, racial ideology, social class ideology, and ableist ideology. Ableist refers to your physical abilities. In conclusion, for this first chapter, sports are integrated into the major spheres of social life, and in such areas that you may not have previously thought about, that we're going to talk about in following chapters, which deal with family relationships, the economy, uh, media and social media, the government and politics, interscholastic sports, and then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the last chapter is major world religion and sports, which is extremely interesting. So that's the end of chapter 1, and we'll move on to chapter 2.